So welcome to this year's readings at Festivalgoers, readings from the authors who were commemorating this year. In particular, the following readings come from the works of Breandán Ó and Liam O'Flaherty. Breandán Ó was a nephew of Liam O'Flaherty's. He was a journalist and author, and he published the Begrudgers Guide to Irish Politics in 1986. The title of Breandán Ó's social satire on Irish politics is, of course, a clear nod to his uncle Liam's tourist guide to Ireland. He's very consciously putting himself in this tradition. So firstly, we'll hear an extract from Liam O'Flaherty's Tourist Guide to Ireland, read by Luke Callinan. The Tourist Guide is one of Liam O'Flaherty's greatest social satires. He wrote about the 1920s, the early years of Ireland post-independence, with the prominence in public life of politicians, priests, publicans and gombeen men. In 1929, at the recommendation of the Committee on Evil, the Censorship of Publications Act established the Censorship of Publications Board to examine books and periodicals and with the authority to ban them. This affected very much Liam O'Flaherty, of course. The first book to be banned by this board was O'Flaherty's expressionist Galway novel The House of Gold, that attacked the gombeen men who had seized power in the Irish Free State following independence. Other works of O'Flaherty were later banned in the subsequent years. And of these novels, 3 were never published in Ireland and indeed never republished since, except that in recent years the publisher Nua Skeita has set about getting them back into circulation. Liam O'Flaherty's view of politicians is what we'll hear about here. Liam keeps his satire fairly general. There are no names. What he describes is not linked to individuals. He describes, I suppose, the state and of the nation and the spirit of the times. So here he has something to say about politicians and a few others into the bargain.
Next to the priests, the politicians are easily the most important class of the Irish community. It's very difficult to estimate whether they are enemies or friends of the tourist. The hookstring peasants supply the rank and file of politicians. The leaders and officials come from the middle classes. The legal profession supplies most of them. The tourist may have been a little surprised and somewhat offended that I did not undertake to examine the legal profession in this country, but he must now understand that I did not do so because the legal profession here is so soaked in politics that it's impossible to make it stand on its own feet and submit to being examined. Let them be examined as politicians. Doctors and strong farmers and labour leaders also act as political leaders, but in lesser quantities. Pig jobbers, cattlemen and geniuses without any economic label have been known to come forward on occasions, but the pig jobbers and cattlemen proved too barbarous even for our none too polite public life, and the geniuses were exterminated as soon as it became known that they were geniuses. In the background, of course, are the priests, who hold the scales of judgment and decide what politicians are to be supported or condemned. But in this study, the priests must play second fiddle. Thus, although patriotism is held in greater esteem in this country than in any other country in the world, there is no other country in the world where patriotism is less in evidence among politicians and among the general mass of the community. For patriotism and the state are so closely allied that love of one is necessarily love of the other. And if any man considers the state an enemy and an institution to be exploited, it follows naturally that he is no patriot. Thus the amazed tourist will see that it's very fashionable for Irish politicians who are not in the government to denounce the government, and then when they get into government, it is equally fashionable for them to use the powers of government for the purpose of robbing the country. Just as he got in touch with the parish priest, he must now get in touch with the politician. In this case, he will not go to a country district. There he would only get small fry like county councillors and the secretaries of branches of political parties and mysterious youths who are members of mysterious organisations known only to the police. Dublin is the hunting ground in this instance. Dublin is the seat of government. It is the headquarters of the principal banks. The treasury is there. The important politicians, therefore, never go very far away from it. For as the honey bee settles on the honeyed flower, so does the politician settle near the money. In this instance, it is absolutely no use for the tourist to go up to a politician and make him a donation of £5 or £10 for his cause. The tourist must pose as somebody whom the politician thinks of importance. If he wants to go among the government politicians, he should pose as a foreign capitalist who has money to invest in the country. Among the opposition, who are at present the party known as Fianna Fáil, he should pose as an American of Irish descent, who is fairly well off for an American and wants to start a newspaper in Ireland on strictly national lines. In this case, he should stress the importance of bringing home to the government the blame for having started the civil war, as that seems to be the principal plank in the programme of the opposition. If he wants to approach the Labour leaders, he should stay at his hotel and spare himself the trouble, because they are dull and identical with Labour leaders in his own country. If he wants to approach the revolutionary groups, he should pose as having come from Russia. He will tell the tourist that the peasants are hopeless. The opposition is appealing to the greed and ignorance of the peasants, and for this reason, in order to counter the opposition, the government must do likewise. In the same manner, he will tell the tourist that in order to counter the opposition, the government has to toy with the idea of resurrecting the Irish language, which is the chief plank in the opposition platform, next to proving that the government was responsible for the Civil War. This toying with the language, he will say, wastes a lot of time and energy, but it's going to be gradually sidetracked and will eventually die out as soon as the last native speaker has emigrated to America, because the politician will be careful to point out, as a phenomenon discovered by a new statistical system invented by the government, that it is impossible to prevent native speakers from emigrating to America for the supposed reason that they feel more at home in that country than in Ireland and have more relatives there. Personally, I doubt this. I am rather inclined to believe that the reason why it is impossible to keep Irish speakers in Ireland is that since they live on doles from their relatives in America, they go over to that country in order to be nearer their source of revenue. But the politician will point out to the supposed capitalist that the government's policy of reviving the language and cutting the ground from under the feet of the opposition is in no way hampered by the disappearance of the native speakers. The government have hired a few men in Dublin to manufacture Irish words according as they are needed.
Our second reading, our second text at this event is an extract from the Begrudgers' Guide to Irish Politics by Breandán Ó, nephew of Liam and Tom O'Flaherty. Like Liam O'Flaherty, Breandán also writes satirically about his own time, the politics of the Irish state, how the origins of the Irish state affected political life in the country, and of course, being a satirical work, it's full of good jibes, yarns, a song, as well as explaining the historical context. Unlike his uncle, I suppose, Breandán actually mentions exact historical and personal details and references. He has chapters on history, politics, the influence of the church and other themes, and a separate chapter on the topic of censorship, which of course affected his uncle Liam and to some extent his uncle Tom too. He begins by outlining the background to the Censorship of Publications Act, the founding of the Knights of Columbanus in 1922, the Committee on Evil Literature, and the Vigilance Committees which helped enforce the Act. And he begins at the beginning of this episode, read now by Jim Ward.
4. A Long, Slow Swim Through a Sewage Bed by Breandán Ó. If Tim Healy came to symbolise the tawdriness of the Free State, the Censorship of Publications Act 1929 and the Board of Censors it established became the trademark of its arid philistinism. This was strange because censorship seemed to affect very few people. It caused little hardship and seemed to be of interest only to visiting journalists in search of a beam in Airden's smiling eye, and to that most peevish of minority groups, the writers and intellectuals. And in fact, there were some writers who agreed with censorship, as it increased the demand for their own unctuous dribblings. The initial legislation was not directed at Irish writers, although the trawl it constructed managed to capture them also. The legislation was intended to keep the Irish people pure in mind and tranquil in the most sensitive areas of their anatomy. In short, it was all about Ireland's great preoccupation, the illicit dart of the other thing, or sex as it is known in the civilised world. It derived from a report by a committee on evil literature, published in 1927, which found the country awash in pornography and in danger of being scuppered. The Act was passed in 1929 and the Censorship Board founded the following year. The Act provided for a board of 5 persons and had the power to prohibit the sale and distribution of any book or periodical it considered in its general tendency indecent or obscene. It also prohibited the publishing, selling and distribution of literature advocating birth control. But Irish writers soon found out they were the principal victims. When a book by an Irish writer was banned, he immediately became a banned writer, and books and bookshops anticipated public reaction to this newfound pornographer in their midst by keeping all his works off their shelves. There was a myth spread that being banned in Ireland helped to sell a writer's work abroad, that it was an advertisement constantly desired by writers. When the number of books banned ran into thousands, to claim that one banned in Ireland was rather like boasting that one had been actually offered sex in a brothel. The hunt for filth and smut was on, and there was no shortage of bloodhounds. Vigilance committees scoured libraries and the country's handful of bookshops, underlining passages that seemed to contravene the Sacred Act. Customs officials ransacked parcels and purloined likely volumes. Rumour had it that they had tried out the dirty bits on their wives in bed before forwarding the books to the board. Gradually, the country began to look deservedly ridiculous. It began to dawn on people of even limited intelligence that we could no longer blame a foreign power for the lunatic acts being carried out without any official sense of shame. Indeed, the legislators, the vigilance committees and the overworked censors burrowed away like moles in the comforting gloom. In the case of the agitation to rid Ireland of literature, while pretending to fight filth, it is well nigh impossible to establish whether the laity were doing the bishop's work for them or whether they were being prodded by invisible ecclesiastical goads. A personal theory, for all it is worth, is that it was a genuine display of repressed sexuality by people masquerading as religious maniacs, wallowing in the pleasure of being able to legally deprive people of one of civilization's greatest pleasures, reading widely. One can have pity for people who were suffering from psychological problems they did not understand. It is difficult to extend that act of charity to those who encouraged them and preyed on their distorted minds. One can feel nothing but contempt for the politicians who were willingly led by their noses into this particular blind alley. A quarter of a century was to pass before they began to back out of it in a manoeuvre which deserves the accolade, the first of the Irish solutions to particularly Irish problems. We shall come to it shortly. But it took a simple book about a simple couple in West Cork to expose the absurdity of Irish censorship, as well as the infantilism of almost the entire Irish Senate. It would undoubtedly have done the same service for the Dáil had that assembly contained even 2 members with the courage to propose and second the motion which Sir John Keane, a Protestant landlord from Waterford, put to Seanad Éireann when the Taylor and Lancety was banned, shortly after its publication in 1942. It was written by Eric Cross, an Englishman, who had made friends with the tailor of Gugan Barra and his wife Anstey, which was short for Anastasia. It was a chronicle of their stories and banter, their observations on life, and their conversations and relationships with neighbours and friends. The tailor was a very well-known person and a noted storyteller in Irish. He had a wide circle of friends, including the band writer Frank O'Connor, who was among the first to protest publicly at the banning. Letters were written to the Irish Times, and Senator Sir John Keane put down a motion that the Censorship Board had ceased to retain public confidence and that steps should be taken by the Minister for Justice to reconstitute the board. In an introduction to a later edition of the book, Frank O'Connor had likened the reading of the report of the Seanad debate to a long, slow swim to a sewerage bed. He also wrote that he felt he would strain his readers' credulity too much if he quoted from some of the many speeches. That introduction was written in 1964, and in truth, much of what was said was incredible even by 1943 standards of obscurantism. But in view of more recent happenings in our native land, perhaps this version of the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes will not go unappreciated in illiberal circles at least. The 4-day pantomime started when Sir John Keane insisted on reading those passages from the book which were commonly presumed to have led to its banning. Senator McGuinness, who was Professor of Metaphysics at UCD and a member of the censorship board, almost lost what little reason God granted him at the thought that these obscenities would appear in the record of the debate and be available to the general public for a few pence. Professor McGuinness came from Belfast, and it was said of him, most unkindly, that he typified the northern nationalists who came south at this time, who by their every utterance put the desire for Irish unity back a decade in time. What is true is that when the government chose him as their representative on the board of the Abbey Theatre, Yeats said he would close the theatre rather than have such a person on its board. To soften this blow to his considerable ego, he was nominated to the Senate by Eamon de Valera and given all the newly published books in the English-speaking world to play with in his spare time. Mr. de Valera, like Mr. Cosgrave, regarded literary censorship as part of our freedom to achieve fuller freedom. The Senate agreed readily to Professor McGuinness's suggestion and voted to censor their own record. The debate then started. It is interesting to trace quotations, as some of them can be identified from the report despite the sanitary precautions. One concerned the tailor's first visit to the Talking Pictures in Macroom Cinema and his comments on what he saw. Adopting the mind of a sex-obsessed censor, one can only find one reference of the type likely to earn the label indecent or obscene in Ireland at the time. It is most enlightening. The tailor found most of the women in the feature film far too thin. A fat lady then appeared, and although he found her more appealing, she was not entirely to his liking. A devil of a great pounder of a woman. She'd make a handy door for a car house. She'd stifle you in bed. People think that fat women are warm. I tell you they are not. They make a damn great tunnel in the bed, and a man may as well be sleeping in a gully. When Sir John Keane finished, his isolated position in the House was made clear when his seconder, the McGillicuddy of the Reeks, stood up and said that although he had seconded the motion, he did not entirely care for the form in which it was presented. Then the troglodytes entered the fray. As Senator Goulding thought the book not alone silly and indecent, but hopelessly tiresome. He thought it an utter travesty of the Irish countryside and its people. Professor Johnson declared that he was against censorship, but admitted to being filled with disgust by the quotations read by Sir John Keane. Professor Liam O'Bohala said, in Irish, that the country needed more censorship, and, in English, that the general feeling of the House was that the sooner the debate was ended, the better. Nevertheless, an awful lot of senators insisted on speaking at length. A Senator Keogh said that 90% of the people did not know the censorship board existed, and that only 2% of the remaining 10% had any animus against it. He had read all the authors, as he put it, from Rabelais down, but a finer collection of smut than the Taylor and Nancy he had never read. A Senator Fitzgerald found the passages read out not alone outrageously immoral, but inconceivably boring. He instanced the common repetition of a phrase about a bull and a cow. This was a reference to Anstey's surprise when a woman came up to her on the road and asked if the animal she was minding was a bull or a cow. Anstey was astounded because she had noticed a marriage ring on the woman's finger. Pádraig O'Malley revealed an interesting view of Irish writers. He admired literature when it was literature. The trouble with second or third rate scribblers was that to get people to read their books they had to have a slap at religion or public decency. That was a noted fact about some of our writers who go across to feed the English public. At this stage, the Minister for Justice, Jerry Boland, intervened to say that it was quite clear from the extracts read in the House that the book deserved to be banned. He congratulated the board and referred particularly to the banning of A Land of Spices by Kate O'Brien. There had been a lot of comment about the fact that this book was banned on the strength of one passage referring to an embrace between two males. He agreed with the banning because the central theme was the class of crime referred to in that passage. Before dealing with Professor McGuinness's contribution, one must refer briefly to one of his disciples, Senator Helena Concannon, a writer of the Lives of the Saints. When the vote was taken, after a long discussion on whether or not the country people talked like the Taylor and Anstey and his wife, or whether such talk could ever take place when women were present, or whether, as Senator Foran contended, one only met Taylors and Ansteys in lunatic asylums, the McGillicuddy of the Reeks had obviously fled to the ancestral peaks, for only one Senator, Joseph Johnson of Trinity College, voted with Sir John Keane. 34 members of our own gentry voted against them. 3 years after this debate, an appeal board was set up. It had very little effect. Most publishers were reluctant to get involved in a process which would have little influence on sales, even if the ban was successful. The board itself continued to ban like blue blazes, and between 1950 and 1955 it has been estimated that it hit an average of 2 books a day. For the benefit of younger readers, it is possible and necessary to point out that almost all Irish writers of note got at least one belt from the board. James Joyce for Stephen Hero, but not for Ulysses, which was published before the Act, but which was not available in shops or libraries anyway. Sean O'Casey, George Moore, Samuel Beckett, George Bernard Shaw. It was said that The Black Girl in Search of God was banned because the black girl had no clothes on. Frank O'Connor, Sean O'Phelan, Liam O'Flaherty, Benedict Kiley, Austin Clarke, John McGahern, Edna O'Brien, Kate O'Brien, Oliver St. John Gogarty and Brendan Behan for Barster Boy were among the better known banned Irish writers. Considerations of space prevent us from giving more than a handful of the best known writers from abroad, living and dead, who had their works stigmatised by the board. There was Freud, de Maupassant, Balzac, Proust, Sartre, Zola, Faulkner, Hemingway, Dreiser, Salinger for The Catcher in the Rye, for God's sake, Sarayan, Maugham, Gide, Gorky, Green, Durrell, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Dos Passos, Mailer, Capote, Orwell, Moravia, and many, many more, lumped in with the authors of such classics as The Shameless Nude, Hot Dames on Cold Slabs, and Me and My Hot Rod. The Irish Association of Civil Liberties, which was established in 1948 to espouse respectable liberal causes, petitioned the Minister of Justice in 1956 to change the law on the censorship of publications. James Everett of Labour was the responsible minister in the second inter-party government, and being a wise Wicklow man, he left the law alone, but appointed 2 mildly liberal men to the board, first marking their cards carefully. Their very presence infuriated the 3 others so much that they resigned rather than see their banning averages fall. They were replaced by the next Minister for Justice, Oscar Traynor of Fianna Fáil, who appointed 3 fairly liberal substitutes. The result was that the banning average fell to a little over a book a day. No legislative changes were made, and the Act remained in force. James Everett could scarcely be called progressive or excessively intellectual. When Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in the first inter-party government, he started the Battle of Baltinglass by appointing one of his supporters as postmaster in place of a woman whose family had run the post office for years. He also spoke strongly against paying large sums of money to mouth organ players from communist countries to play in the Radio Éireann Symphony Orchestra, and remarked more than once that his yardstick for programmes was the man lying on his settle bed in Wicklow after his hard day's work.